Picture this. You are sitting at a desk, staring at a really dense technical manual. Or maybe it is a complex financial report or a difficult piece of code.
Oh, I know exactly where you were going with this.
Right. You know the feeling? You read the exact same paragraph 3 times in a row. Your eyes track across the letters, you recognize the vocabulary, you reach the bottom of the page, and then you look away.
And you realize you have not retained a single word of it.
Not a single word. And there is this deeply visceral, sinking feeling that comes with that experience. The immediate psychological reaction is almost always self-deprecation.
You start thinking your brain is just broken.
Exactly. You think you are not smart enough to grasp the material, or you assume you have just hit the ceiling of your own intelligence.
That feeling of hitting a cognitive wall is so universal. But the interpretation of that failure is where things go entirely wrong, which is why I'm so glad we were talking about this. Welcome to TalkKast, by the way.
It really is the perfect place to start, because the fundamental problem in that scenario is never a lack of raw intelligence. It is actually a biological mismatch.
A biological mismatch, meaning we are just using the equipment wrong.
We are entirely misusing the equipment. We have adopted this cultural assumption that the brain operates like a computer hard drive. We act as if we can just, click a button, keep our eyes on the page, and endlessly download files into our memory banks.
We basically assume that exposure equals learning.
Yes, exactly. But the secret to mastering complex information in a fast-paced world is not adding more brute force study time to your schedule. The real advantage lies in fundamentally changing the physical architecture of how you acquire knowledge.
The hard drive metaphor is so deeply ingrained in us, though. We just assume that if the data is in front of our eyes and we are awake, the data must be saving to the disk.
But if the brain is not a passive storage device, then trying to force-feed it information through endless passive reading is the absolute worst approach.
It explains why someone can spend 6 hours staring at a textbook and perform terribly, while someone else studies for 90 minutes and completely masters the concept.
Precisely. To understand why that endless reading method fails so spectacularly, we have to look at the strict physical limitations of the machinery we are using.
So what is actually happening in the biological hardware of the brain when we try to force that massive volume of information inside?
It all comes down to the metabolic cost. Learning is an incredibly expensive physical process. Just being awake, sitting still and maintaining basic bodily functions uses about 20% of your body's total energy supply.
20% just to sit there.
Just to sit there. But when you start shoving complex, novel concepts into the prefrontal cortex, the region that handles executive function and new ideas, you create a massive localized spike in the demand for glucose and oxygen.
Let me challenge the scale of that energy drain for a second, because when we talk about feeling tired after reading a dense report, people usually assume that it's just psychological fatigue. They think they're just bored.
They think they're losing motivation.
But you are saying this is a literal, quantifiable depletion of physical resources, like muscle fatigue after lifting weights.
It is entirely physical. The brain is an organ-burning fuel to create electrical impulses. When you encounter novel information, your neurons have to fire rapidly to process the data and build new synaptic connections.
And that rapid firing requires a constant influx of energy.
Constant energy. So when you feel that heavy, foggy sensation after an hour of intense concentration, your prefrontal cortex is literally signaling a localized energy crisis. The fuel gauge is dropping.
That makes a lot of sense.
And compounding this metabolic drain is an even more severe limitation when it comes to our working memory.
Which is the cognitive workspace where you actively hold and manipulate new information.
Right. And that workspace has an incredibly restricted capacity. Your working memory can only hold about 4 distinct chunks of information at any given time.
Only 4 chunks? That seems almost impossibly small. I know people will immediately push back on that number.
I hear that all the time.
They will say, well, I can remember a 10-digit phone number or a grocery list of 10 items, so a strict limit of 4 sounds incorrect. How do we define a chunk here?
A 10-digit phone number is actually the perfect way to illustrate the mechanics of a chunk, because you do not actually remember 10 isolated digits.
You group them together.
Exactly. You remember the area code as one single item, the next 3 numbers as a second item, and the final 4 numbers as a rhythm or a sequence. You have just taken 10 discrete pieces of data and grouped them into 3 chunks.
Oh, I see what you mean. That is how we cheat the limit.
Yes, but you can test the raw biological capacity of your working memory very easily. Try to hold 5 completely disconnected abstract words in your head at the exact same time without repeating them aloud or writing them down or making a story out of them.
That sounds extremely difficult.
It is profoundly difficult. Most people will drop the first word by the time they hear the fifth. The space just runs out.
So if we visualize working memory, it is not this vast reservoir. It is more like a tiny 4-ounce cup.
A perfect analogy, a 4-ounce cup. When you sit down and try to cram for an exam or speed read a 50-page technical brief, you are essentially trying to pour a whole gallon of water into that tiny 4-ounce cup.
And the cup does not magically expand just because your deadline is approaching.
It certainly does not. The brain literally spills the excess data out to protect the system from structural overload.
The spillover is completely unavoidable, which explains why the 5th, 6th, and 7th concepts you read in that textbook paragraph simply vanish into the void. You cannot force the cup to hold more volume.
And this highlights a really critical misunderstanding about the sensation of learning. When you are grappling with new material and you feel that intense mental strain, you are conditioned to view that strain as a sign of failure.
You think you are just not getting it fast enough.
Right. But in reality, that mental friction is simply the biological reality of the machinery working at maximum capacity. It is supposed to feel hard.
The cognitive strain is actually the indicator that your brain is attempting to construct new neural pathways.
Exactly. If the 4-ounce cup is our strict biological limit, then the standard modern approach to learning is fundamentally broken. We live in an era of infinite passive input.
People try to learn coding by watching 4 hours of tutorial videos on passive playback.
Or they try to master a new corporate strategy by just listening to a lengthy presentation. If passive consumption just guarantees that most of the water spills on the floor, we have to look closely at the distinction between gathering facts and actually building mastery.
There really is a profound difference between memory and mastery, and passive consumption only provides the illusion of mastery.
I always think of the historical case of Kim Peek. He was the savant who inspired the movie Rain Man.
Right. He had an extraordinary ability to memorize thousands of books word for word. He was essentially a walking repository of raw data.
Of a perfect hard drive. Yet, despite having all of that factual information perfectly stored in his neural architecture, he struggled to perform basic daily tasks or understand complex, abstract reasoning.
That is a stark illustration. Having the data stored on the hard drive does not mean the operating system knows how to execute the program.
Exactly. Gathering facts is not the same as building a real-world skill. But the problem is that passive consumption makes us feel highly productive.
When you spend 3 hours highlighting lines in a textbook or copying notes verbatim from a whiteboard, you definitely feel a sense of accomplishment. You feel like you are putting in the hard hours.
But you're really just experiencing the illusion of competence. When you reread a highlighted passage, your brain recognizes the words, and that recognition feels smooth and easy, which creates a false signal of fluency.
Your brain tells you, I know this.
But you do not actually know it. You merely recognize it. True experts operate on an entirely different level. Think about a chess grandmaster or a concert pianist.
A grandmaster does not memorize 100,000 independent, disconnected facts about where pieces can move. They recognize structural patterns. They see the relationships between the pieces.
And that transition from the illusion of competence to actual mastery brings us to a concept that completely changed how I view the learning process.
Which is?
Well, if passive recognition feels smooth, but achieves nothing, then the real learning process must inherently require friction.
We often feel frustrated when we cannot instantly recall a fact, and we assume our memory is failing us.
But that struggle to remember is actually the mechanism of memory itself. It is called the generation effect.
The generation effect. So when you are forced to generate an answer from scratch, rather than just passively reading it, you are actively firing the specific neural circuits required to retrieve that information.
Yes. The physical struggle of reaching into your memory and pulling out the answer is the exact signal the brain needs to strengthen that specific pathway.
I like to think of it like learning to ride a bicycle. When you first get on the bike, you wobble uncontrollably.
And that wobbling feels incredibly frustrating. It feels like you were doing it entirely wrong.
But the physical struggle of wobbling, the constant micro-corrections your muscles are making to prevent you from falling, is the exact process that teaches your neurological system how to balance.
If someone held the bike perfectly steady for you every single time, you would never learn to ride it yourself.
The wobble is the active ingredient in the learning process.
It is the only ingredient that matters. If you simply reread a pair of vocabulary words, you are sending a very weak, passive biological signal. The brain has zero incentive to dedicate resources to permanently storing that connection.
But if you look at the primary word, cover up the translation, and force yourself to guess the answer before checking, you are actively generating the knowledge.
Even if you guess incorrectly, the mental effort of the attempt primes the neural pathway. When you finally reveal the correct answer, the brain encodes it much more deeply because you already established that baseline of cognitive tension.
This biological necessity for struggle brings up a massive contemporary problem, does it not? We have built an entire ecosystem of modern tools specifically designed to eliminate cognitive friction.
We absolutely have. We have created artificial intelligence systems that act as flawless stabilizers for the bicycle.
Which leads us to the AI paradox in learning. We're looking at a scenario where the ultimate convenience tool is actively degrading our ability to build permanent neural pathways.
The data on this is incredibly striking. Researchers recently observed groups of students learning complex subjects. One group utilized generative AI to assist in generating answers and completing assignments.
And the control group?
The control group used traditional, friction-heavy study methods. They had to struggle through the material themselves. On a surprise test administered weeks later, the AI-assisted group scored roughly 57%.
Wow. And the traditional group?
The traditional group scored 68%.
By outsourcing the wobble, the AI group never actually learned how to ride the bike.
Exactly. They let the algorithm maintain the balance, so their own brains never signaled the need to thicken those neural pathways. It is pure cognitive offloading.
You are using the AI as an exoskeleton to lift the heavy weight, but then you wonder why your own muscles are atrophying.
That is the perfect way to frame it. AI should never be utilized as a crutch that removes the desirable difficulty from the acquisition phase. If you use it to instantly generate an essay structure or solve a coding problem from scratch, you completely bypass the generation effect.
So what is the biologically aligned approach to using these tools?
A much smarter approach is to treat the AI as a strict coach. You must attempt the work first. You endure the friction, you write the flawed code, you draft the messy paragraph, and you exhaust your working memory.
Only after you have generated the output do you ask the AI to evaluate your logic, point out your blind spots, or suggest optimizations.
The metabolic struggle must always precede the correction.
Since we have established that passive input is a trap, and we know our working memory is severely limited to that tiny 4-ounce cup, we are really left with a mechanical engineering problem.
A very difficult one. We live in a world of massive, overwhelming data sets. How do we take a complex subject like organic chemistry or a new programming language and physically fit it into a brain that can only hold 4 concurrent thoughts?
We have to move into the first step of the practical architecture for effective learning. We have to compress the data.
Compression. Yes. Compression is the act of taking an overwhelming, chaotic pile of individual details and distilling them into a few highly organized schemas or conceptual frameworks.
To make that concrete, let us return to the chess grandmaster. When a novice looks at a chessboard mid-game, they see 32 individual pieces arranged in a chaotic geometry.
Their working memory is immediately overwhelmed just trying to calculate the potential moves of 3 different pawns. They hit the 4-chunk limit instantly.
But the grandmaster is looking at the exact same physical board, and they are not experiencing cognitive overload at all.
Because the grandmaster is utilizing profound data compression. They are not actually looking at 32 independent pieces. Through years of practice, their brain has grouped common piece configurations into single conceptual schemas.
When they glance at the board, they might recognize a specific pawn structure. And that single pattern instantly dictates a historical strategy, the defensive weaknesses, and the optimal attack vectors.
They have taken thousands of individual, granular facts and compressed them into one unified concept. When the grandmaster holds that one pattern in their working memory, it only occupies one of their 4 available cognitive slots.
But it contains a massive cascading amount of embedded information.
Exactly. That is how you bypass the 4-ounce cup. You compress gallons of water into a single dense drop.
That is a beautiful mechanism for a highly structured logical system like chess or mathematics, but I have to push back on how universally applicable this is.
Pushback. It is a valid concern.
What if the learning task does not possess elegant underlying logical patterns? What if you are a medical student forced to memorize the names of hundreds of anatomical structures, or you have to memorize the sprawling arbitrary geography of the globe? How do you compress data that has no inherent logical symmetry?
When the data lacks inherent structure, You must manufacture the patterns yourself.
Mhm.
And you accomplish this through deliberate chunking and narrative association.
So if you are handed a list of 20 completely random cities to memorize, you cannot brute force 20 separate items into a 4-item capacity.
You cannot. It will spill over. You must invent connections. For example, you notice that the capitals of France and Germany are Paris and Berlin. So you create a chunk based on the letters P and B.
You are grouping abstract facts into spatial or narrative stories.
Yes. If you need to understand the vast geography of Australia, you do not just memorize its square mileage in a vacuum. That is a weak, isolated data point.
Instead, you visually overlay its landmass size onto a map of the continental United States. You build a relational framework.
By doing this, you ensure that activating one single mental trigger creates a cascading effect that unlocks multiple associated facts.
You are essentially creating a compressed file directory in your brain. You take 20 loose, chaotic text files, bundle them into a single folder, give the folder a vivid, memorable name, and now your working memory only has to hold on to that one folder.
That is exactly what compression is. It vastly reduces the immense burden on the prefrontal cortex. But, as you can probably guess, compression is only the foundational layer.
Because once you have built these folders and memorized the schemas, you only possess theoretical knowledge. You know what the chess pieces do, but you do not know how to actually win the game under pressure.
Having the data organized is totally useless if you cannot execute it. Memory is not mastery. Once you have compressed the facts, you have to compile the code.
Compiling the code. This is the second step of the architecture.
Yes. Compiling is the phase where we transition from understanding the theory to physically performing the skill. And this is where we have to deeply respect the biological rhythms of the human body to avoid exhausting the hardware.
Compiling implies taking the raw instructions and translating them into an executable program. In human terms, this means structured practice.
Structured practice, yes. But we are culturally obsessed with the marathon grind. We applaud the person who locks themselves in a library for 8 hours straight.
But if we are operating within strict metabolic limits, how should we actually structure this compilation phase?
We must align our study habits with our ultradian rhythms. The brain naturally operates in distinct cycles of varying alertness, functioning at peak capacity for roughly 90-minute intervals.
During a 90-minute focus cycle, your brain can sustain the high metabolic demand required to actively encode new skills.
However, if you attempt to push past that 90-minute threshold without a significant reset, you hit a steep wall of diminishing returns. The metabolic cost becomes unsustainable, the fuel gauge drops, and the brain simply stops encoding new information effectively.
You are essentially revving a car engine while it is in neutral. You are bringing fuel, but you are not moving forward.
Exactly. So the fundamental unit of deep learning is a 90-minute sprint.
But within that 90-minute block, if I am intensely focused on compiling a new skill, say I'm deep into a complex coding problem, does taking a break disrupt the cognitive flow state? We are often told that breaking concentration destroys productivity.
The concept of the unbroken flow state is slightly misunderstood when it comes to the acquisition of new, difficult skills. Microbreaks are not just helpful. They are biologically essential for the compilation process.
Really? What is the mechanism behind that?
There is a deeply fascinating neurological quirk at play here. When you are learning a new sequence and you pause for a mere 10 to 20 seconds, literally just taking your hands off the keyboard, closing your eyes, and doing nothing, your brain does not actually stop working.
What is it doing during that pause?
During that tiny window of rest, the brain rapidly replays the specific neural pattern you just executed, and it replays it at 10 to 20 times normal speed.
I need to clarify the magnitude of that. You are saying that a 10-second physical pause triggers an unconscious high-speed neural review session.
Yes, it is the biological equivalent of getting 20 free, high-speed practice repetitions simply by stopping the physical action for a moment.
That is mind-blowing.
It is incredible. The brain uses that micropause to run a rapid background defragmentation, solidifying the connections of the sequence you just attempted.
So the optimal protocol is to work intensely, hit a point of friction, pause for 10 to 20 seconds to allow the brain to replay the data, and then immediately dive back into the effort.
That is the exact protocol. It completely redefines the concept of taking a break. It is not an escape from learning, it is an accelerator for it.
And alongside those micro breaks, how should we structure the actual practice within that 90-minute block to ensure we are compiling the skill effectively?
We have to utilize rapid, immediate feedback loops, which are often called learn, test, learn cycles. The traditional, deeply flawed model of education involves studying a concept for 3 consecutive weeks, and then taking one massive high-stakes test at the end to see if the knowledge held.
That timeline is far too extended. The feedback loop is too slow to correct the wobble on the bicycle. You could be practicing the wobble incorrectly for 3 solid weeks.
Exactly. The delay prevents real-time neural correction. The superior method is to shrink the timeline drastically.
So if you are learning a new programming language, you do not read the entire manual before writing a line of code.
You study a specific syntax rule for maybe 45 minutes. Then you close the reference window entirely, and you immediately try to write a functional piece of code from scratch, relying purely on your working memory.
And because it is new, you will almost certainly fail. You will encounter an error.
And that failure is the generation effect in action. You are forcing the cognitive struggle.
When you fail, you immediately open the reference material, identify the exact point of the error, correct your mental model, and try again.
You are testing the compilation of the knowledge in real time. You are building the skill, breaking it immediately to find the weak points, and patching the neural pathways on the spot.
So we compress the chaotic data into organized schemas, and we compile the skill through intense 90-minute sprints filled with micro breaks and immediate testing.
But if you walk away from the desk at that exact moment, the new skill is incredibly vulnerable. The neural pathway is built, but it is fragile. It has not become a permanent structural component of your hardware yet.
The fragility of new memories is a crucial vulnerability in the learning process. If you stop at the compilation stage, the newly acquired skill will rapidly degrade. It needs to set.
Which brings us to the third and most neglected step of the architecture: consolidation.
Think of the entire process like pouring a concrete foundation for a building. Compressing the data and compiling the skill through intense practice is the equivalent of mixing the cement, the sand, and the water and pouring it into the mold.
But wet concrete cannot support a building. Consolidation is the chemical curing process. You have to step back and leave the concrete completely alone so it can harden into an impenetrable structure.
If you just keep mixing the concrete or if you keep agitating the mold, the foundation never cures.
The resting time is the active ingredient that transforms the raw materials into permanent structural strength.
So where does this biological curing process actually take place in the brain?
For the human brain, the most profound and vital consolidation occurs when you are entirely disconnected from the material. The curing process is sleep. Every single night, your brain executes a massive, highly orchestrated file transfer.
During the day, as you are struggling and compiling new skills, those fragile new memories are temporarily held in the hippocampus. And the hippocampus acts like a temporary USB drive. It has limited capacity, and the data on it is highly volatile.
So the 90-minute sprints are just loading data onto the USB drive. It's not on the main hard drive yet.
Correct. The permanent storage location is the cortex. But the transfer from the hippocampus to the cortex does not happen while you are actively learning. It requires a specific physiological state.
During deep, slow-wave sleep, the brain essentially shuts down sensory input from the outside world. The hippocampus takes the fragile data recorded during the day and rapidly replays it, transmitting those patterns to the cortex, where the information is permanently integrated into your broader web of knowledge.
This neurological reality completely destroys the mythology of the college all-nighter.
It destroys it entirely. There is this pervasive cultural badge of honor where people brag about staying awake for 36 hours to cram for an exam or finalize a project.
If you stay up all night cramming data into your working memory, you are continuously pouring wet concrete, but you are intentionally denying the system the opportunity to cure it.
An all-nighter is a biological disaster for long-term learning. It's the most inefficient strategy imaginable. By depriving yourself of deep sleep, you are actively blocking the hippocampus from executing that critical file transfer to the cortex.
You are holding massive amounts of data on a volatile USB drive. You might be able to hold on to enough of it to pass a test the following morning through sheer working memory strain, but the data is never permanently consolidated.
Within days, those temporary files are overwritten or discarded by the brain. All of the intense metabolic effort, all of the glucose burned during the struggle and compilation phases is essentially wasted.
It is a phenomenal waste of biological resources. Without a structured macro break, like a 20-minute walk or a deep rest after an intense 90-minute sprint, and without a full night of high-quality sleep following a major learning session, the architecture collapses.
The gains are simply washed away. The data on spacing out learning sessions confirms this beautifully. You will achieve vastly superior retention if you study a topic for 1 hour a day over 4 days, allowing sleep to consolidate the information each night, compared to studying the same topic for 4 continuous hours in a single day.
Even though the total time invested is identical, the biological mechanism of sleep multiplies the effectiveness of the spaced approach.
This is a profound shift in perspective. It dictates that stepping away from the desk, going for a walk, and prioritizing 8 hours of sleep are not signs of laziness or a lack of dedication.
They are mandatory, non-negotiable biological steps in the learning process. You cannot build the building without letting the concrete cure.
It is the most critical phase of the entire operation. If we synthesize the complete picture, it becomes clear that the individuals who learn the fastest and adapt the quickest in any complex field are almost never supercomputers with massive amounts of raw, unyielding brain power.
They're simply individuals who treat their own cognitive processes like a precise biological science.
They honor the constraints of the hardware.
They do not attempt to force a gallon of chaotic data into a 4-ounce cup of working memory. They follow the specific biological architecture.
They deliberately compress overwhelming details into structured schemas. They actively compile the knowledge into executable skills through focused 90-minute sprints, utilizing the generation effect and micro breaks.
And finally, they consolidate those fragile gains into permanent architecture through the neurochemical curing process of deep sleep.
Approaching learning from this mechanical perspective is incredibly liberating. It strips away the emotional weight and the guilt of feeling slow, easily distracted, or intellectually inadequate.
It replaces the anxiety of the struggle with a clear, reliable blueprint. You do not need to upgrade your intelligence. You do not need to alter your fundamental capacity.
You simply have to stop fighting against the strict biological reality of the machinery you already possess.
When you align your efforts with the mechanical reality of your brain, the friction becomes a tool rather than an obstacle. You start working with the system instead of attacking its limitations.
And this leads to a fascinating implication about the future of how we work and learn. If our neural architecture absolutely requires friction to build strength, and we are currently entering an era where our entire technological environment, from AI assistants to instantaneous search engines, is aggressively designed to eliminate all cognitive friction, we are facing a profound environmental mismatch.
We're optimizing our external world for ultimate convenience, which might inadvertently be engineering an environment that causes our internal cognitive capacities to atrophy.
It forces us to ask whether we need to start artificially engineering the struggle back into our daily routines, simply to keep the hardware functioning at its peak. The most unfair advantage you can cultivate in a world overflowing with infinite passive information is the discipline to deliberately engage with the struggle, letting your brain do exactly what it evolved to do best.
Thanks for listening to TalkKast.